It's wonderful to see all of you here this afternoon, and yes, you are absolutely in for a treat. David is a talented political and cultural commentator who has been an op-ed columnist with the New York Times since 2003. He's worked as an editorial writer and film reviewer for the Washington Times, a reporter and op-ed editor for the Wall Street Journal, a senior editor at the Weekly Standard, a contributing editor at Newsweek and the Atlantic Monthly, and he's currently a commentator on the PBS NewsHour. He's a prolific writer of books and essays, and he has won many awards. However, I think his greatest accomplishment is that he is a proud Pitzer parent and father of Naomi. He is known for his humor and intellectual passion, and he's a profound observer of the American way of life and a savvy analyst of present-day politics and foreign affairs. And he's really one of my favorite writers, and I would say that even if he wasn't sitting right in front of me. In his book, The Social Animal, he comments about the role that educators play. He says, "The point of being a teacher is to do more than impart facts. It's to shape the way students perceive the world, to help a student absorb the rules of a discipline. The teachers who do that get remembered." And I hope that we all can remember the teacher who did that for us. And I was exceptionally lucky as I went through college to find faculty who were like the faculty here at Pitzer College, who made an indelible impression in my life. The faculty at Pitzer will be, I hope, among your students' favorites, and a particularly talented young man, Phil Zuckerman, has recently published a book, and David commented about Phil in the New York Times. This is what he said: "As secularism becomes more prominent and self-confident, its spokesmen have more insistently argued that it should not be seen as an absence, as a lack of faith, but rather as a positive moral creed." Phil Zuckerman, a Pitzer College sociologist, makes this case as fluidly as anybody in his book, Living the Secular Life. So I'm actually getting in, a little word for Phil in addition to introducing David. So thank you. All right. So since this is Parents' Weekend, I thought I would close with this last quotation by David about parenting. And I will confess that the first time I read this, I was so relieved, I just wanted to jump up and down with joy. David says, "If there is one thing developmental psychologists have learned over the years, it is that parents don't have to be brilliant to succeed. They don't have to be supremely gifted teachers. Most of the stuff parents do with flashcards and special drills and tutorials to hone their kids into perfect achievement machines don't have any effect at all. Instead, parents just have to be good enough. They have to provide their kids with stable and predictable rhythms. They need to be able to fall in tune with their kids' needs, combining warmth and discipline. They need to establish the secure emotional bonds that kids can fall back upon in the face of stress. They need to be there to provide living examples of how to cope with the problems of the world so that their children can develop unconscious models in their heads." Absolutely exquisitely put. And today, David will be speaking about a topic that is near and dear to our hearts: liberal arts education. David Brooke.
Thank you, Laura. It's been a pleasure to get to know you over the past 3 years, and sorry it'll all go downhill now. I am a proud Pitzer parent. I'm now a somewhat addled Pitzer parent, having seen my daughter's dorm room about an hour ago. There are sometimes you just have to close your eyes as a parent and hope it'll go okay, because did there have to be so many bottles lying around, empty bottles? I will be brief. I've been around Pitzer long enough to know you didn't actually come here to hear me speak. You came here to hear yourself speak. And so I'll try to get out of the way of that. We actually took this great tour of Pitzer, and I wanted my daughter to go to the most conservative school in America. And someone told me Pitzer, it's a Mormon school in Southern California. Pat Robertson teaches there, and so it's somewhat different than I expected. Leads the country in bumper stickers, I notice. Actually, I grew up somewhat left-wing. I grew up in Greenwich Village in the 60s. My parents were somewhat on the left. They took me to a thing in 1965 called a Be-In, where hippies would go just to be. And one of the things they did was they set a garbage can on fire and threw their wallets into it to demonstrate their liberation from money and material things. And I was 5, and I broke from the crowd, reached into the fire, and grabbed some money and ran away. And that was sort of my first step over to the right. Then I went to a place called Grace Church School in Lower Manhattan, if anybody knows the Strand Bookstore, where I was part of the all-Jewish boys' davening choir. We sang, but we were Jewish, so we didn't want to sing the word Jesus. So we just left the word out. And the volume would drop, and then we'd come back up. And then I had my own introduction to the liberal arts. Actually, I had it through my parents. They were college professors. And I knew I wanted to be a writer at age 7. And so what this school represents was inculcated early. I remember in high school, I wanted to date a woman named Bernice. She didn't want to date me. She dated some other guy. And I was thinking, what is she thinking? I write way better than that guy. But I went off, thanks to the admissions committee at Brown and Wesleyan and Columbia, I went to the University of Chicago. Where fun goes to die. That's less true now, to be fair. The thing that's true, the best saying about Chicago, is it's a Baptist school where atheist professors teach Jewish students St. Thomas Aquinas. And now, because I only really teach at schools I couldn't have gotten into, I teach at Yale, where I do teach a lot of the Achievement Machine kids. I wrote in one of my books that if you go to an elementary school at 3 in the afternoon in an affluent suburban area, you got all these cars driving up like Saudis and Saabs and Audis. Driven by Saudis and Iranians, but no. No, my joke is that in sort of where I live in suburban D.C., you can have a luxury car so long as it comes from a country hostile to U.S. foreign policy. That's okay. And they get picked up by these creatures I wrote about in one of my books called Uber Moms, who are highly successful career women who've taken time off to make sure all their kids can get into Yale. And you can tell the Uber Moms because they actually weigh less than their own children. Sort of at the moment of conception, they're doing little butt exercises to stay fit and trim. At the moment of delivery, they're cutting the umbilical cord, flashing little Mandarin flashcards at the things. And so by the time they reach me, they're super achievement machines. I ask my kids, what are you doing at spring break? It's like, I'm unicycling across Thailand while reading to lepers, that sort of thing. But they are, I would say in this, I love Yale, and I love my students, but they're a little imbalanced. The achievement ethos is so strong, they've really had little time for anything else. And one of my kids said, their spiritual side is undernourished. And one of my kids said, we're so hungry. And they are hungry for that. And the thing I've seen in a couple of my kids, it's always like 20%, is that their parents love them. And their parents are so anxious for them to succeed. And so these two factors combine so the beam of love hits them very intrusively, but the beam of love is a little brighter when they're doing what their parents want, that they think will lead to success. And then when they get off the balance beam, the beam of love diminishes. And it gets bad. I had some of my kids, they took jobs their parents didn't want, so the parents not going to come to commencement. And so it becomes like the wolf of conditional love is sitting out there. And when you see the parents withdrawing because the kid is doing what they don't want, you see the effect of conditional love, which is to undermine all the criteria the children or the students have. They're so terrified of losing that love, the core love relationship of their life, that it just dissolves them inside. And I become fervent on this subject because the need for unconditional love and letting the kids make their own decisions, those of us who have kids at this age, we did what we could do. And we can guide and we can advise. But to withdraw love based on the decision they're going to make about their own lives, it's made me so militant on this subject. And I tell you kids, you owe your parents respect, and you owe them honor, and you owe them love. You don't owe them your lives. And this is something I've seen the bad effects of this. And Um, and but Pitzer is different. The atmosphere is different, and Pitzer has the balance better. And schools that leave a mark, they have it in the classroom, but then they have a culture that you feel when you go in and you walk into. And Pitzer has a nice balance, and that's one of the things I valued in Naomi's time here. And so the way I think about this balance is that you can divide the virtues into two sorts of virtues: the resume virtues and the eulogy virtues. And the resume virtues is the thing you bring to the marketplace, and the eulogy virtues are the things they say about you after you're dead. Whether you were honest, courageous, brave, whether you were capable of love. And we live in a culture, we all know the eulogy virtues are more important, but we live in a culture that praises the resume virtues and that organizes and emphasizes the resume virtues. We're just more articulate about those things. And most of us, including myself, have spent most of our lives thinking more about career than how do I develop the depth that I'd like to have. And a book that helped me organize my thinking about this was a book written in 1965 by a guy named Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik called Lonely Man of Faith. And he says we have two sides of our nature which correspond to these two virtues, which he calls Adam 1 and Adam 2. And Adam 1 is the external resume Adam. It's the one who wants to build things, create things, write books, discover scientific discoveries, make an impact on the world. Adam 2 is the inner Adam, the humble Adam, who wants to be enveloped by love, security, and meaning, not only to do good, but to be good inside, to have an inner soul that honors our own possibilities. And so Adam 1 wants to conquer the world, Adam 2 wants to hear a calling and serve the world. Adam 1 savors accomplishments, Adam 2 savors the scent of a warm meal, the atmosphere of people out for drinks. Adam asks how things work, Adam 2 asks why things exist and what ultimately we're here for. Adam 1 wants to venture forth, Adam 2 wants to return to roots. Adam 1's motto is success, Adam 2's motto is love, redemption, and return. Now, Soloveitchik's argument is that these two sides of our nature are in us, and they're both legitimate, and they have to be balanced, but they live in confrontation with each other. There's tension between the two sides of our nature. And I'd add that the hard part of this confrontation is they live by different logics. Adam 1, the external Adam, lives by an economic logic. Input leads to output, practice makes perfect, effort leads to reward. Adam 2 lives by an inverse logic, which is a moral logic and not an economic one. You have to give to receive, you have to surrender to something outside yourself to gain strength within yourself. You have to conquer the desire to get what you crave. Success leads to the greatest failure, which is pride. Failure leads to the greatest success, which is humility and learning. In order to fulfill yourself, you have to forget yourself. In order to find yourself, you have to lose yourself. And so we live in a culture that is so achievement-oriented that moral logic just drains away. And it drains away in a lot of colleges. There's a sociologist at Notre Dame named Christian Smith who went around to college campuses asking college students about their moral lives. And he wrote a book called Lost in Transition. The main feature of the book is they're not bad. The kids, college students are amazing, but they're inarticulate. They have not been given categories to think about this stuff. And so he asked them, can you name your last moral dilemma? And 70% couldn't name a moral dilemma. They didn't know what it is. So they'd say, I pulled into a parking space, but I didn't have enough quarters. And they'd say, it's a problem. It's not really a moral dilemma. And so they just lost the vocabulary. And so I think a lot of what colleges need to do is provide the academic research, but provide the education at least to give them a vocabulary. So as they go through life and bad stuff happens, they will know a vocabulary of morality and virtue. And I've spent a lot of time thinking about this problem. We use all these words. What do we mean? They're sort of fuzzy in our heads. So, for example, we use the word character. We want somebody to have good character. Or we use depth. We want to be deep. And so what does that mean? What does it mean to have character? And so I was just thinking, well, what do we mean by that word when we use it? The first thing we mean is consistency over time. That the things that lead us astray tend to be short-term, like lust, fear, vanity, and gluttony. The things we call character are long-term: courage, honesty, humility, the ability to have a long obedience in the same direction. Second, to have scope, not to be a free-floating person, but to be firmly attached to things. In the realm of intellect, a person of character has a set of permanent convictions about permanent truths. In the realm of emotion, a web of unconditional loves. In the realm of actions, a permanent commitment to tasks that can't be completed in a single lifetime. And so scope. And then I think in the third thing we would say of someone of character is they have a sort of solidity inside. There's a core piece of us, the part of us that makes moral decisions, and that core piece is slowly malleable by us. If you make disciplined choices and you do things in a consistent way, you build that core piece into something solid and dependable. If you make selfish and short-sighted choices, you degrade that core piece and you make it inconstant, fragmented, and your life will somehow fall apart eventually. And so somebody of character is trustworthy. And so then we come to the liberal arts, and what can we do to teach character? I once wrote a column about the difficulty of teaching it in a classroom. And I got an email from a veterinarian in Oregon, a guy named Dave Jolly, who I've never met. And he wrote, "The heart cannot be taught in a classroom intellectually to students mechanically taking notes. Good, wise hearts are obtained through lifetimes of diligent effort to dig deeply within and heal lifetimes of scars. You can't teach it or email it or tweet it. It has to be discovered within the depths of one's own heart when a person is finally ready to go looking for it and not before. The job of the wise person is to swallow the frustration and just go on setting an example of caring and digging and diligence in their own lives." Then a couple sentences that really leapt out of me. "What a wise person teaches is the smallest part of what they give. The totality of their life, of the way they go about it in the smallest detail, is what gets transmitted. Never forget that the message is the person, perfected over lifetimes of effort that was set in motion by yet another wise person, now hidden from the recipient in the dim mists of time. Life is much bigger than we think, cause and effect intertwined in a vast moral structure that keeps pushing us to do better, become better, even when we dwell in the most painful and confused darkness." And so the sentences that leapt out of me from this was the job of the wise person, or what a wise person teaches is the smallest part of what they give. The message is the person. I think that's true of the teachers here and the teachers of a good liberal arts school, that the way they become scholars and the way they approach ideas and the way they teach their students is what gets transmitted. I suspect if we all think back at the great teachers in our lives, it's not the curriculum they taught, it's who they were, their way of being a historian. And yet I don't think that's totally it. It's not just the example of the person. There's something morally virtuous in understanding the world, and there's something virtuous in having different vocabularies of orality from which to choose. And then there's finally, we understand that people get better in their lives when they look at exemplars, when they look at people who came before and who have lived well. And we can learn from them at least how they did it if we don't know how we did it. And so if we go back and have a liberal arts education which was filled with biography and filled with novels and filled with the arts which widen the repertoire of our emotions, I do think we learn valuable things, not just the quality of the personality or the quality of the culture of a place. And I'm sure if we all took college tours at the beginning of this process, and if you go from college to college, the culture is so different in each place. And they take individual kids from, might be demographically the same, and 3 or 4 years later, the kids are just different. They're marked by the different cultures, the power of each individual campus culture. But when I look at the people who I admire and who I've read about books about, there are certain activities that I do think lead to character and depth. And so I'm just going to list 3 or 4 of those activities, which I think you learn from reading biography novels. The first activity, we wouldn't say somebody has character and depth if they were not capable of great love. And a book I read that exemplified the sort of love I'm talking about was written by a guy named Douglas Hofstadter, who was a mathematician at Indiana University. And Hofstadter was married to a woman named Carol, and they had 2 children who at that time were 5 and 2 when they went on sabbatical, I think to Italy, and Carol suffered an aneurysm and died very suddenly. And Hofstadter had a picture of Carol on the nightstand. And he looked at that picture every day, probably after her death, and here's what he wrote. "I looked at her face, and I looked so deeply that I felt I was behind her eyes. And all at once I found myself saying as tears flowed, 'That's me, that's me.' And those simple words brought back many thoughts that I had had before, about the fusion of our souls into one higher level entity, about the fact that at the core of both our souls lay our identical hopes and dreams for our children, about the notion that those hopes were not separate or distinct hopes, but were just one hope, one clear thing that defined us both, that welded us into a unit, the kind of unit I had but dimly imagined before being married and having children. I realized that though Carol had died, that core piece of her had not died at all. but that it had lived on very determinedly in my brain. And so he's talking about a love that merges two minds together. And so the first thing love does is humbles you. It reminds you you're not in control of your own passions. It's worth emphasizing on Valentine's Day. It's like an invading army you want to be invaded by. The second thing love does is it decenters the self. Egotism is desperate longing in a small space, but the person in love realizes the center of his life is not inside himself, it's in another person. And many observers, Montaigne said this, love eliminates the distinction between giving and receiving, because your lover is part of yourself, so when you give to your lover, you're giving to yourself. And Montaigne writes that a friend who allows his friend to give him a gift is doing the greatest favor of giving his friend the pleasure of giving the gift. So it decenters the self. The third thing love does is it opens up hard ground. It's like a plow that digs through the crust and opens up the heart for something softer and a greater vulnerability. And we all know people who've been softened by love. And finally, love leads to service. One of my heroes is a woman named Dorothy Day, who was the sort of person, she read novels, and she couldn't just read the novels, she became the novels. And as a young woman, unfortunately, she read a lot of Dostoevsky. And so she drank a lot, she lived in an attic, she was really poor, she caroused a lot, she was depressed a lot, suicide attempts, a couple abortions, and her life was somewhat of a mess. She had a child with a common law husband, and she realized that all the accounts of childbirth she'd read were written by men, and so she wrote one. And one of the passages said, she wrote it like 40 minutes after giving birth. She said, if I had painted the greatest painting, sculpted the greatest sculpture, composed the greatest symphony, I could not have felt the more exalted creator than I did when they placed my child in my arms. And with that came a need to worship and to adore. And that need to worship translated into faith, a Catholic faith. She founded a Catholic social worker movement. She founded a radical newspaper, homeless shelters, and lived for 60 years a life of unbelievable service, transformed by the love for a child and the gratitude that produced. And so what we see in love is it humbles you, it decenters you, and then it lifts you up. And that would be the one thing that I think all people of character have. The second thing is suffering. People who've had great character have usually had a season of suffering, whether it's Lincoln with depression, FDR with polio. And suffering is the same basic shape. First, it humbles you. The theologian Paul Tillich said it drags you deeper into yourself and reminds you you're not who you thought you were. Tillich wrote that suffering is like you have a hole, a floor, what you think is the basement of your soul. It digs through that hole, revealing a cavity below, digs through, revealing a cavity below and a cavity below. It just digs you into yourself. So suffering, like love, shatters the illusion of self-mastery. And then, so it digs you down, but then it pulls you up. It gives people a sense of calling. People have an instinctive sense to turn suffering into transcendence. I have two friends who lost a kid when he was 6, and they didn't say, well, we've been in grief for 2 years over the loss of Henry, so let's go party it up and balance our happiness accounts. Nobody does that. They wanted to connect their suffering and Harry's suffering to something holy and transcendent, so they created a foundation called Hope for Henry, so other kids can be prevented from going through what he went through. And so they turn suffering, brings you down, and then pulls you up. And it's that same V shape. The third thing I think we would say most people who have character have is a sense of calling and vocation. Another of my heroes is a woman named Frances Perkins, who was the first cabinet secretary, the first woman in a cabinet under FDR. She was labor secretary. She was a highborn lady who went to Mount Holyoke in class of 1902, and Holyoke was one of those colleges that left a mark on its students. The rules at Holyoke were a little different than the rules at Pitzer. One of the rules was freshmen shall not speak to sophomores. A freshman greeting a sophomore on the sidewalk shall bow respectfully. So I don't think that would work here. But it taught women in those times an incredible sense of heroic service, and it sent them off around the world to do missionary work and to AA work. And so there are single women, 1902, they're going off to Tibet, to Pakistan, to Africa, to the Middle East, all by themselves. And somebody did a census of American female missionaries abroad in 1920, and 30% of them were Holyoke grads. So it just was an amazing place. She went there, was transformed by a heroic sense of service, which was unfocused until she was having coffee or tea one afternoon in Washington Square Park in New York City. And she hears a commotion. The ladies she's having tea with rush outside, run across the square, half block down, and they see a fire. And they've stumbled across the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire on the 8th, 9th, and 10th floor of this building off the square. And they see what they think are bundles of clothing being thrown out the windows, but it's not like 9/11. People are jumping out of the windows so they won't be burned to death. And she watches 57 people go over, one guy lifting a woman over the windowsill, dropping her into space, a second and a third and a fourth. His girlfriend, they kiss, he drops her, and then he goes over. And at that moment, she hardened her vocation, and she became dedicated to the cause of worker safety. She went up to Albany, became a lobbyist, discovered that the Tammany Hall legislators were not taking her seriously. And so but she realized she kept a folder at home called Notes on the Male Mind. And she realized that they would not take her seriously as a young woman, but all guys want to be loved by their mothers. So she dressed up as their mothers, like an 80-year-old woman with a frumpy dress, gray pearls, tri-corner hat, got the nickname Mama Perkins, and was a very successful lobbyist in a lot of important legislation. But she found, commencement speakers generally give college graduates incredibly crappy advice. Not only do we leave them all this debt, we give them bad advice so they'll never pay it off. And one of them is find your passion, follow your passion. Like you're 22, you're supposed to look inside and find your passion. And what Perkins did was she didn't think, well, what do I want from life? She asked, what is life questioning me to do? What are my circumstances questioning me to do? And it was this fire that defined her life, or helped define her life. And the vocation came from outside. What does life want from me? Not, it's all about me. What do I want from the world? And she had a life of amazing service as FDR's cabinet secretary. And so I've described a couple things that I think lead to character. The love, the suffering, the vocation. They drag you out of yourself, and then they lift you up. And so there's that same V-shaped pattern. Kierkegaard has a phrase that the hero has to go to the underworld to rescue the beloved. You have to go down to go up. And so I do think that's a pattern you see again and again in life. People who are able to defeat themselves. People who are aware of their deepest weaknesses and then make those weaknesses their strength. And that's one things we see over and over and over again. And then the final stage is, at the end of it, is grace. And grace is, of course, a religious word. It means unmerited love. But for the religious and the non-religious, it means being held up by people you didn't expect to. And the people who go down and then come up find the hands have come to hold them up. And so that's when we talk about character, it has this negative orientation, that you have to develop character through hardness and self-discipline, and that's sometimes part of it. But the people you see who have real character and who have real depth, they know that they are broken and sinful, but they know that they require redemptive assistance from outside. You see them, they have a sense of humility, and sometimes we think humility is thinking lowly of yourself. It's more accurately defined as not thinking yourself at all, or realizing you're unfit for the tasks that have been assigned to you, or realizing you're an underdog in the struggle against your own weaknesses, or my favorite definition, which is accurate self-understanding from a distance. And so the people we have that have these abilities, and they have been held up by faith, and they have committed themselves by something longer than their self-interest. And if you look at Frances Perkins, if you look at Dorothy Day, if you look at other heroes of mine, George Marshall, whose life was dedicated to the military, if you look at, going through history, Bayard Rustin and Philip Randolph, underrepresented and underknown civil rights heroes, they all have gone through this period of brokenness, and they've all come out. And what you see at the end of their lives is a moment of tranquility. And this is sort of the reward. It's not chaste, but it's the byproduct of people who've gone through this process and when iron has entered their soul. I mentioned Day. Well, let me mention another figure who Day modeled her life around. which is St. Augustine. And Augustine had, talk about overpressuring parents, he had the helicopter mom to beat all helicopter moms. Her name was Monica. He was like 27, he had a kid, he wanted to leave Africa, and Monica wouldn't let him. He had to trick her, get on a boat, she's on the shore screaming at him, come back here. She chases him across to Italy. She spends her life hounding him. And she makes him divorce the woman he loved so he could marry a 10-year-old. And she's just completely pressuring, but completely loving. And he can't get away from her, and he loves her, he hates her. And at the end of his life, he has his famous scene in the garden where he becomes a Christian of the sort Monica liked. And Monica says to him, she was 56 at the time. She said, I wanted my life for you to become a Christian of this sort. And you have. And so really the purpose that what I wanted in life has been fulfilled. God has given me this. And it becomes clear as they're talking that this is it for her. She's had what she wants from life and she's ready to die. And in fact, she would die 9 days later. But Augustine records the conversation. They're sitting in a different garden and they start talking. And he talks about the sweetness of the conversation after a lifetime of conflict. And the sweetness, and then he has a long sentence of how they're merging, of how after a difficult relationship, they're becoming one. And he has a long sentence which is very hard to read and understand. It's just very long and very complicated. But there's a word that appears through it again and again and again. And that word is hushed. And he says the sound of the breeze was hushed, the sound of the birds was hushed, the sound of the wind was hushed, the sound of our voices were hushed, the sound of our hearts were hushed, the sound of ourselves was hushed, even the sound of our hearts was hushed. And you get this great sense of this tempestuous relationship settling into peacefulness and gratitude. And it's when you see people who've achieved great character, and they may not be famous. I met some women who teach immigrants to read, and it takes them 7 years to teach them the language and how to read. Incredible patience, and they had that settled steadiness of voice that I associate with Augustine. And that's the byproduct of not needing to strive anymore when Adam 1 bows down to Adam 2. And as Brian Williams learns, Adam 1, there's no satisfying him. But Adam 2 can be satisfied because his needs are not limitless. And so I think when you have a liberal arts education, you go to a college like this one, you just become conversant in those sorts of lives. And you become conversant in the writers who can tell you, who know you better than you know yourself, and who can teach you about yourself. And one of those writers for me was a guy named Reinhold Niebuhr, a theologian from the 50s, every Jew's favorite Christian. But he had a sentence which sums up a lot of what I've been saying. Nothing that is worth doing can be achieved in our lifetime, therefore we must be saved by hope. Nothing which is true or beautiful or good makes complete sense in any immediate context of history, therefore we must be saved by faith. Nothing we do, however virtuous, can be accomplished alone, therefore we must be saved by love. No virtuous act is quite as virtuous from our own standpoint as from another standpoint. Therefore, we must be saved by the final form of love, which is forgiveness. And I do think that's the sort of paced moral wisdom that is at the end of first a liberal arts education and then a life that's lived into the seeds that were planted when you're 18 to 22. So thanks.